Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into something truly extraordinary. We're going back, way back, to a time before the pyramids, before Babylon's hanging gardens, before any of the civilizations you learned about in school. We're going back to Sumer, to the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where humanity's first cities rose from the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia. And we're going to explore what the ancient texts themselves, not modern speculation, not pseudoscientific fantasy, but the actual clay tablets written in cuneiform over 4,000 years ago, tell us about what came before human civilization as we know it. Before we dive in, if you're watching from late at night in Tokyo, or maybe it's morning in Berlin, or you're unwinding after work in Sao Paulo, drop a comment letting me know where you are and what time it is. I love seeing this community spread across the globe, all of us fascinated by the same ancient mysteries. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button because we're going on quite a journey together. Maybe dim the lights, get comfortable, perhaps turn on a fan or make some tea. We're going deep tonight. Now I know what brought many of you here. You've probably heard the sensational claims: ancient aliens, genetic engineering, gold mining operations, gods from the stars. The Anunnaki have become synonymous with ancient astronaut theories, with claims that they built impossible structures, that they created humans as slave labor, that they possess technology that defies explanation. And I'll be honest with you, those stories are compelling. They're exciting. They make ancient history feel like science fiction. But here's what's even more fascinating: what the texts actually say. Because when we peel back the layers of modern interpretation, mistranslation, and deliberate distortion, we find something far richer, far more complex, and in many ways, far more interesting than the sensational narratives. Tonight, we're going to explore what the Sumerian texts genuinely reveal about the Anunnaki, who they really were in Mesopotamian cosmology, what they supposedly created and established according to the mythology, and what all of this meant to the people who wrote these texts. We'll examine the actual archaeological evidence. We'll look at specific tablets with proper translations. And yes, we're absolutely going to address the misinformation that's flooded popular culture. We'll talk about why certain translations are wrong, which scholars have corrected these errors, and what the authentic understanding reveals about one of humanity's earliest attempts to understand cosmic order, divine hierarchy, and the origins of civilization. So let's begin at the beginning, at the very foundations of Sumerian thought, in a time the ancient texts themselves describe as antediluvian, before the Great Flood, in an age when the gods walked the earth and the patterns of civilization were first being laid down. We need to start with the fundamental question: who were the Anunnaki? Not according to popular theories, but according to the people who actually worshipped them, who wrote about them, who built temples in their honor. The word Anunnaki itself is Sumerian, and like so much in this ancient language, it carries layers of meaning. In cuneiform, it's written as Anunnaki or sometimes Anunna, which scholars translate as those of princely seed or princely offspring. The A can indicate water or semen, the primordial generative force. Nun means prince or lord. Na has possessive or collective implications, and Ki relates to earth or place. Already, we're dealing with something more nuanced than those who from heaven to earth came. A popular but problematic translation we'll address later. The Anunnaki, in authentic Sumerian religious thought, were a class of deities, not a species of extraterrestrials, not astronauts, gods in a complex pantheon that the Sumerians, and later the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, believed governed the cosmos. In the earliest Sumerian texts, dating from around 2600 to 2300 BCE during the early dynastic period, the Anunnaki appear as a collective group of deities associated with judgment, fate, and the underworld. They weren't the highest gods. That distinction belonged to figures like in the sky god, Enlil, god of wind and storms, Enki, god of wisdom and freshwater, and Ninhursag, the mother goddess. The Anunnaki were something like a divine council, a senate of gods who made decisions about cosmic and earthly matters. The texts from the city of Shuruppak, one of the oldest Sumerian cities, mention the Anunnaki in administrative contexts, lists of gods receiving offerings, hierarchies of divine power. These tablets, preserved in the museum collections in Baghdad, Berlin, and Philadelphia, show a religious system where the Anunnaki functioned as judges and decision-makers among the gods. They decreed fates. They witnessed cosmic events. They were present at creation. Now, this is crucial for understanding what comes next. When Sumerian texts describe what the Anunnaki built or established, they're operating within a mythological framework where divine action and cosmic ordering are synonymous. The Sumerians didn't make the hard distinctions we do between natural and supernatural, between myth and history. For them, the gods' actions explained why the world is the way it is. The Anunnaki's construction projects weren't engineering feats in our modern sense. They were the establishment of cosmic order, the setting up of the fundamental patterns that make civilization possible. Let's look at the most important text for understanding this: the Eridu Genesis, also called the Sumerian flood story. This composition, which survives in fragments from the Old Babylonian period around 1600 BCE, but likely dates to much earlier oral and written traditions, describes a time before the flood when the earth was young. The tablet, catalogued as MS 3026 in the Scoian collection, begins with a remarkable scene of primordial creation. According to this text, after Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag had created the black-headed people. That's what the Sumerians called themselves. The gods looked upon the earth and saw that it was wild and unorganized. The Anunnaki, under the direction of the senior gods, began the process of ordering the world. But what does this mean? What did they actually build? The text describes the establishment of kingship, the lowering of kingship from heaven to earth. This is a fundamental concept in Mesopotamian thought. Me, written with a cuneiform sign that looks like a pillar or standard. Me are the divine powers, the fundamental rules of civilization. They're not abstract principles, they're concrete things, almost like technologies of order. There's the me of kingship, of priesthood, of warfare, of sexual intercourse, of music, of writing. More than 100 me are listed in various texts, and they represent everything that makes civilization possible. According to the mythology, the Anunnaki didn't build physical structures before human civilization. They established the patterns, the cosmic blueprints that would make human civilization possible. In the composition called Enki and the World Order, dating to the Ur-III period around 2100 BCE, we see this process described in vivid detail. Enki, the god of wisdom who was sometimes counted among or separate from the Anunnaki depending on the text, travels the earth establishing the me in different locations. He decrees the fate of Sumer, Meluha, probably the Indus Valley, Dilmun, likely Bahrain, and other places. He assigns gods to their proper positions. He organizes the cosmos. The text, preserved in multiple copies at the University Museum in Philadelphia and the Iraq Museum, describes Enki filling the Tigris and Euphrates with water, placing fish in them, establishing the grain goddess Ashnan, appointing Enkimdu as the god of irrigation, and setting up Kaptu as god of pickaxe, brick, and foundation. Notice what's happening here. The Anunnaki and the gods associated with them are establishing the fundamental systems that humans will use. They're not building canals, they're instituting the very concept of irrigation. They're not constructing buildings, they're ordaining the principles of architecture. This brings us to one of the most famous and most misunderstood Sumerian compositions, Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. Now, technically this is an Akkadian text from around 1200 BCE from Babylon, but it draws heavily on earlier Sumerian traditions and represents the continuation of Mesopotamian religious thought. In this epic, we see a detailed account of cosmic construction, and the Anunnaki play a specific role. After Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, defeats Tiamat, the primordial goddess of the Salt Sea, he splits her body and creates the heavens and earth from her corpse. He establishes the stars, the calendar, the seasons. And then, And this is significant. He has the Anunnaki build Babylon. Specifically, they build Esagila, Marduk's temple, and the ziggurat Etemenenki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. The tablet, of which 7 copies exist in the British Museum and the Louvre, describes the Anunnaki laboring for a full year to construct this sacred complex. But here's what's crucial. This is describing events in mythological time, in Elo Tempor, the sacred time of origins. The text is explaining why Babylon is sacred, why the temple has cosmic significance, why the rituals performed there connect earth and heaven. When it says the Anunnaki built Esagila, it's establishing the divine prototype for all temple building. Every temple constructed by humans is an imitation of this primordial act, a recreation of the sacred time when the patterns of worship were first laid down. Archaeological excavations at Babylon, conducted by Robert Koldewey for the German Oriental Society between 1899 and 1917, and more recent work by Iraqi and international teams, have revealed the actual Esagila complex. It's magnificent, but it was built by human hands, by human labor, over centuries. The mud bricks bear the stamps of Nebuchadnezzar II and other historical kings. The construction techniques are distinctly Bronze Age and Iron Age Mesopotamian. There's no mystery technology, no unexplained engineering. What we have is a culture that understood the cosmic significance of their building projects, that saw themselves as continuing the work the gods began in mythological time. Let me share something that illustrates this beautifully: the foundation deposits. When Mesopotamian kings built or renovated temples, they placed inscribed objects in the foundation: cylinders, tablets, figurines. These weren't structural, they were ritual. They contained inscriptions like, "For Marduk, his lord Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, patron of Esagila and Ezida, has made this temple." But they often also reference the primordial building, the mythological construction by the gods. The king sees himself as fulfilling the divine pattern, as maintaining what the Anunnaki established. Now let's talk about cities, because one of the most persistent claims in alternative theories is that the Anunnaki built the first cities, that human civilization was a gift or implant from these beings. The Sumerian king list, a composition known from multiple copies but primarily from the Weld Blundell prism in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, opens with a famous line: "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." Then it lists the antediluvian kings, rulers who supposedly reigned for impossibly long periods, 800 years, 36,000 years before the flood. This text has been wildly misinterpreted. Some have read it as a historical record of impossibly ancient civilizations, of rulers with extended lifespans granted by alien genetics. But scholars of Sumerian literature understand this as mythological prehistory, a genre common to many ancient cultures. The fantastical reign lengths are symbolic, indicating a primordial golden age when time operated differently, when the cosmic order was being established. The cities mentioned, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, were real places, and archaeological excavations have revealed their actual histories. Let's take Eridu, which the texts identify as the first city, the place where kingship first descended. Excavations by the Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities in the 1940s and 1950s, led by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd, uncovered a remarkable sequence of temples built one atop another, dating back to approximately 5400 BCE in the Ubaid period. These weren't monolithic structures appearing suddenly. They were small shrines, gradually enlarged over centuries, rebuilt and expanded as the settlement grew. The earliest temple, Temple 1 at the bottom of the sequence, was a simple rectangular room with an offering table and possibly an altar. Over the next 1,000 years, the community built Temple 2, then Temple 3, each slightly larger and more elaborate. By the time we reach Temple 7, around 4500 BCE, We have a substantial building with a tripartite plan that became characteristic of Mesopotamian sacred architecture. The archaeological evidence shows continuous cultural development. The pottery evolves, the construction techniques improve, the settlement expands. This is organic growth, human innovation and tradition building over generations. But the Sumerians later looked back on Eridu as the primordial city, the place where civilization began, where the Me were first established. In their mythology, Enki had his temple there, the Iabzu, the house of the cosmic waters. The god had chosen this place and made it sacred. In the composition, Enki and Ninhursag, set on the mythical island of Dilmun, we see another aspect of what the gods supposedly established before human civilization. Dilmun is described as a pure, clean place, but it lacks fresh water. Enki provides this essential resource, filling the land with water from the earth. Then plants grow, and Ninhursag creates 8 plants. The text goes on to describe various acts of creation and establishment. Now, scholars identify Dilmun with the island of Bahrain and possibly parts of the eastern Arabian coast. Archaeological excavations there, by teams from France, Denmark, and Bahrain itself, have revealed a culture that was indeed important in Sumerian trade networks, providing copper and serving as an entrepot for goods from the Indus Valley. But the development was human. The settlements appear around 3200 BCE, contemporaneous with the rise of civilization in Sumer itself. The water comes from natural springs and the water table, not divine intervention. The point here is that the Sumerians explained their world, their trade relationships, their resources, through mythological narratives about what the gods established. The Anunnaki and the other deities created the patterns, and humans lived within those patterns, maintaining and continuing them. Let's look at another crucial text, the Atrahasis epic, which exists in Akkadian versions from around 1700 BCE, but again draws on older Sumerian traditions. This composition provides the most detailed account of human creation in Mesopotamian literature, and it directly involves the Anunnaki in a way that's been spectacularly misrepresented in popular theories. According to the epic, preserved in tablets from the British Museum and other collections, there was a time when the gods had to do all the work themselves. The Anunnaki, the great gods, had to dig the rivers, excavate the canals, perform the labor of maintaining the cosmos. And they grew tired. They rebelled. They went to Enlil's gate and surrounded his house, demanding relief from their toil. The solution: the gods decide to create humans to bear the workload. The mother goddess Beletili, with the help of Enki, creates humanity from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, specifically Willa or Jeshtui, a god who possessed intelligence. The humans are made in the image of the gods, possessing divine intelligence, but they are mortal and subordinate. Now this is where things get twisted in popular retellings. Some claim this is evidence of genetic engineering, that the Anunnaki created humans as a slave species through advanced biotechnology. But this completely misreads the genre, the cultural context, and the purpose of the text. This is ideological myth, a story that explains why things are the way they are. It answers fundamental questions. Why do humans toil? Why do we have intelligence? Why do we serve the gods through ritual and offering? What is our place in the cosmic order? The text is theology, not history. It's sophisticated religious thought about the nature and purpose of human existence. The Sumerians and Babylonians saw themselves in a reciprocal relationship with the divine. The gods created humans to serve them, yes, but humans also sustained the gods through offerings and rituals. The temples were called houses where the gods dwelt, and the priests maintained these houses, feeding the god statues, clothing them, tending to their needs. In return, the gods maintained the cosmic order that allowed civilization to flourish. Dr. Thorkel Jacobson, in his landmark work, The Treasures of Darkness, points out that Mesopotamian religion was fundamentally about cosmos versus chaos, order versus disorder. The gods represented ordering principles. Enki was wisdom and craft. Enlil was authority and storm. Inanna was love and war. The Anunnaki collectively represented divine judgment and decree. Humans participated in maintaining this order through their labor, their rituals, their cities. Archaeological evidence overwhelmingly supports a purely human development of Mesopotamian civilization. The transition from the Ubaid period through the Uruk period to the early dynastic period shows continuous technological and social evolution. We can trace the development of irrigation, the invention of the potter's wheel around 4000 BCE, the introduction of the plow, the gradual emergence of writing from counting tokens to impressed clay tablets to full cuneiform script by 3200 BCE. The excavations at Uruk Biblical Erech, conducted by German teams beginning with Julius Jordan in the 1920s and continuing to recent work by the German Archaeological Institute, have revealed this progression in extraordinary detail. The Ina precinct, sacred to the goddess Inanna, shows temple construction evolving over centuries. The famous limestone temple and the later structures show increasingly sophisticated architectural techniques, but all firmly within human capability. The invention of writing itself, which occurs at Uruk around 3400 to 3200 BCE, can be tracked step by step. The earliest tablets are administrative records, counts of grain, livestock, textiles. They use pictographic signs representing concrete objects. Gradually, the system becomes more abstract, developing phonetic elements, grammatical markers, the ability to express complex language. By the early dynastic period, we have literary texts, royal inscriptions, legal documents, a fully developed writing system. There's no mysterious jump, no inexplicable leap that requires outside intervention. Each development builds on the previous one. The scribal schools, the Edubba or tablet houses, train generations of scribes in the complex art of cuneiform. We have their practice tablets, their exercises, their mistakes and corrections. This is human learning, human tradition. Now here's where it gets fascinating. Because the Sumerians themselves created a mythological account of the gift of civilization, and it involves the me we discussed earlier. In the poem Inanna and Enki, the goddess Inanna visits Enki's city of Eridu. Enki, perhaps a bit drunk on beer, gives her the me, all the fundamental elements of civilization. Inanna loads them onto her boat and takes them to her city, Uruk. Enki regrets his generosity and sends various servants and monsters to retrieve the me, but Inanna's assistant Ninshubur protects them, and they reach Uruk safely. This myth explains why Uruk became the dominant city in the late 4th millennium BCE. It explains the shift in power and prestige. But notice what it's saying. Civilization's elements are transferable, are gifts, are possessions that can be moved from place to place. The me include kingship, priesthood, sexual practices, music, metalworking, writing, leatherworking, building, and much more. The Sumerians understood that civilization is a package of skills, technologies, and social structures. And where did they think these ultimately came from? The gods. Specifically, the high gods like Enki and Inanna working with, and sometimes in the context of the Anunnaki Council. But, and this is crucial, the myths don't describe the gods teaching humans these skills directly, like Prometheus bringing fire. Instead, the myths describe a time when the gods established these patterns in the cosmos, and humans, created with divine intelligence, learned and developed these skills, working within the framework the gods ordained. Let me address something that often comes up: the supposed advanced technology described in Sumerian texts. Claims about flying machines, nuclear weapons, genetic laboratories. Where do these come from? Primarily from a series of profound mistranslations and willful misreadings of the texts, popularized especially by Zecharia Sitchin in his Earth Chronicles series beginning in the 1976 book, The 12th Planet. Sitchin claimed to be able to read Sumerian and presented translations of various texts that supposedly described the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru who came to Earth to mine gold, genetically engineered humans as workers, and possessed advanced technology. His books have sold millions of copies and have profoundly influenced popular understanding of Mesopotamian mythology. Here's the problem. Sitchin's translations are wrong. Not slightly off, not matters of interpretation, fundamentally, demonstrably incorrect. And scholars of Sumerology have been pointing this out for decades. Dr. Michael Heiser, a biblical scholar with training in ancient Near Eastern languages, wrote extensively debunking Sitchin's claims. In his website and book, The Facade, Heiser goes through Sitchin's translations line by line and shows the errors. For example, Sitchin translates Anunnaki as those who from heaven to earth came. But as we discussed earlier, the actual etymology is princely offspring or seed of royalty. The word for heaven is An or Anu, but Anana has a different construction. It's related to Nuna's seed or descendant. Sitchin claims that the Sumerian word Shem, which he translates as rocket ship, actually means a memorial stone or a name. The word appears in the story of the Tower of Babel, where humans want to make a Shem for themselves. Sitchin interprets this as building a rocket, but every Semitic language scholar agrees it means making a name or reputation for themselves. The context makes this clear. They want to build a city and a tower so they won't be scattered across the earth, so their name will be remembered. The supposed planet Nibiru is another mistranslation. The word Nibiru appears in Mesopotamian astronomical texts, but it refers to a crossing point or transition, possibly Jupiter or a specific stellar phenomenon, not a 12th planet in a 3,600-year orbit. Dr. Francesca Rochberg, a specialist in ancient astronomy, has written about Mesopotamian celestial science and makes clear that while the Babylonians were sophisticated astronomers who developed mathematical models of planetary motion, their texts describe the observable planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, which they could see with the naked eye. Sitchin also claimed that the Anunnaki came to Earth to mine gold, specifically from Africa, and that this gold was used to save their planet's atmosphere. None of this appears in the texts. The gods do value gold as a precious metal for adornment and cult objects, just as humans did. But there's no story of atmospheric repair, no mention of monatomic gold suspended in an alien atmosphere. These are Sitchin's inventions, unsupported by any cuneiform tablet. Dr. Irving Finkel of the British Museum, one of the world's foremost cuneiformists, has stated in interviews that Sitchin's work is essentially fiction based on misunderstanding of the language. Dr. William Moran of Harvard, a specialist in Akkadian, similarly dismissed the translations as unreliable. The consensus among trained scholars is absolute. Sitchin's readings do not represent what the texts actually say. But why does this matter? Why spend time debunking these claims? Because they obscure the actual richness of Mesopotamian thought. When we strip away the fantasy of ancient astronauts, we find something more valuable: humanity's earliest wrestling with profound questions. How did the world come to be? What is our purpose? How should society be organized? What is justice? What happens after death? The Sumerians and their successors developed complex, sophisticated answers to these questions. Answers that influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that shaped Western thought. The Epic of Gilgamesh, probably humanity's oldest literary work, explores mortality, friendship, the abuse and proper use of power, the limits of human achievement. When Gilgamesh goes on his quest for immortality after the death of his friend Enkidu, he's confronting universal human concerns. The text, preserved in multiple versions with the most complete being the standard Babylonian version on 12 tablets from Nineveh, doesn't need ancient aliens to be profound. Its explorations of grief, meaning, and mortality speak across 4,000 years. Let's return to what the texts actually say about what the Anunnaki established. In the composition, Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, which exists in Sumerian versions from around 2100 BCE, we get a cosmological picture. The text describes a primordial time after heaven and earth were separated, after the gods had made their various claims to different parts of the cosmos. And the sky god took heaven, Enlil took the earth, Ereshkigal was given the underworld. This is the basic cosmic structure in Mesopotamian thought. Heaven, earth, and underworld, three tiers with appropriate divine rulers. The Anunnaki are associated especially with the underworld in many later texts. In Inanna's descent to the underworld, when the goddess descends to visit her sister Ereshkigal, she must pass through 7 gates, removing an article of clothing and divine power at each. When she arrives, the Anunnaki judge her and decree her death. They fix their eyes of death upon her, and she becomes a corpse. Only the intervention of Enki saves her. The Anunnaki here function as a tribunal, a divine assembly that enforces the laws of the underworld. This is a far cry from alien geneticists. These are mythological beings representing cosmic order, the inescapable laws of death and fate. Every human must eventually face the Anunnaki in the underworld, where they will be judged. The concept influenced later Jewish and Christian ideas about divine judgment, about the soul's journey after death. What else did the text say the gods established before civilization? Agriculture is a big one. In the poem, the debate between grain and sheep, 2 goddesses, Ashnan grain and Lahar sheep or livestock, argue about which is more important. But the text begins by describing a time before either existed, when the Anunnaki didn't know bread or woven cloth. And Enlil create these goddesses to provide food and clothing for the gods and humans. The goddesses get drunk and quarrel, and Enlil and Enki must settle their dispute. This is ideological myth explaining why both agriculture and pastoralism are necessary, why both grain and livestock are gifts of the gods. The Neolithic Revolution, the actual development of agriculture, occurred in the Fertile Crescent beginning around 10,000 BCE in the Levant and spreading to Mesopotamia by 8,000 to 7,000 BCE. The archaeological record shows the gradual domestication of wheat, barley, sheep, goats, and cattle. It was a human achievement, though the myths attribute the ultimate origin to divine gift. Similarly, metalworking is described as a divine gift. The god Ninigel is the god of metalworkers. In various texts, the gods are described as possessing tools and weapons of metal. The actual development of copper metallurgy began in the Near East around 5000 BCE, with bronze working developing by 3300 BCE. The Sumerians imported copper from Oman and tin from Afghanistan, developing trade networks across vast distances. Texts from the Ur-III period include detailed accounts of metal workers' rations, production quotas, and finished products. Again, human achievement within a mythological framework of divine patronage. Let me share a specific example that beautifully illustrates how the Mesopotamians thought about the relationship between divine establishment and human activity. The city of Lagash and its ruler Gudea. Around 2100 BCE, Gudea served as Ensi ruler of Lagash, and he left us an extraordinary set of inscriptions, including 2 large clay cylinders covered in cuneiform text, now in the Louvre. These cylinders describe Gudea's renovation and rebuilding of the Eninu, the temple of the god Ningirsu in Lagash. But before describing the physical construction, Gudea recounts a dream in which Ningirsu appeared to him and commanded the project. The text describes how Gudea consulted various omens, purified himself and the city, gathered materials from distant lands, cedar from Lebanon, copper from the mountains, gold and silver and precious stones from various sources, and then set the workers to their task. The inscription describes the construction in detail, the laying of foundations, the building of walls, the decoration of the temple, but it frames this human activity within a cosmic context. The gods themselves are described as involved, blessing the work, ensuring its success. When the temple is complete, Ningirsu takes up residence, and Gudea institutes the proper rituals and offerings. What we have here is human accomplishment, Gudea's organizational skill, the workers' craftsmanship, the trade networks that supplied materials, understood as participating in divine order. The temple isn't just a building. It's a sacred space where heaven and earth meet, where the god dwells, where the patterns established by the Anunnaki in primordial time are maintained and renewed. Archaeological excavations at Lagash, ancient Gursu, conducted by French teams beginning in the 1870s and continuing to recent work, have uncovered Gudia's city, including remains of the Eninu temple. We've found statues of Gudia, administrative tablets from his reign, construction materials, all confirming the historical reality behind the inscriptions. But the texts themselves show how Mesopotamians integrated history and myth, human and divine action. Now let's talk about the flood, because this is another area where the Anunnaki play a crucial role in the texts, and where there's been enormous confusion and speculation. The flood story appears in multiple Mesopotamian versions: the Eridu Genesis we mentioned earlier, the Atrahasis epic, the standard Babylonian flood story incorporated into the Epic of Gilgamesh as Tablet XI, and others. The story is famous for its similarities to the biblical Noah's flood, and yes, there's almost certainly a connection, with the Hebrew account influenced by Mesopotamian traditions. In the Atrahasis version, the flood comes about because humanity has multiplied and become noisy, disturbing the gods' rest. Enlil decides to destroy humanity, but Enki, who has a fondness for humanity, warns Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim in the later Gilgamesh version, and tells him to build a boat. The Anunnaki are involved in the decision to send the flood. It's a collective divine decree. But after the flood waters come, some of the gods regret their decision. In the Gilgamesh version, the goddess Ishtar, the Akkadian Inanna, laments that she agreed to the destruction. When Utnapishtim's boat finally comes to rest on a mountain and he offers sacrifice, the gods, starved of offerings during the flood, gather around the smoke like flies. The Anunnaki realize they need humanity. The relationship is reciprocal. Enlil eventually blesses Utnapishtim with immortality, and the gods establish a new order with humans, but with controls on population, disease, infertility, predators, so humanity won't again become too numerous. Now, some have claimed this story is a memory of some ancient cataclysm, perhaps related to the end of the Ice Age and rising sea levels, or even of alien intervention. The geological evidence does show a period of significant flooding in Mesopotamia around 2900 BCE, revealed by a layer of water-deposited sediment found in excavations at Ur, Uruk, Shuruppak, and other sites. Sir Leonard Woolley, excavating at Ur in the 1920s, famously claimed he'd found evidence of Noah's flood. But the flood layers at different sites don't date to exactly the same time, suggesting multiple local floods rather than one universal deluge. The Mesopotamian flood story is doing mythological work, explaining human mortality, establishing the relationship between gods and humans, showing the consequences of divine anger and divine mercy. It's sophisticated theology, not garbled history of ancient aliens. Let me address one more persistent myth: the claim that Sumerian texts describe the solar system with remarkable accuracy, including planets that weren't discovered until modern times. This claim centers on a cylinder seal, catalogued as VA 243, held in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin. Sitchin published a drawing of this seal in his books and claimed it depicted the sun surrounded by 11 planets, including all the known planets plus Nibiru. Scholars who have actually examined the seal disagree completely. Dr. Michael Heiser analyzed the seal in detail and concluded that Sitchin's drawing doesn't accurately represent what's on the seal. The cluster of dots Sitchin identifies as planets is more likely a star constellation or simply decorative elements. Cylinder seals typically show mythological scenes, gods, worshippers, ritual acts, monsters, not astronomical diagrams. The iconography of VA 243 shows a figure approaching a seated figure, likely a worshipper before a god, with various symbols around them that are standard in Mesopotamian art. Even if the dots represented celestial bodies, There's no reason to identify them as planets specifically, or to assume the larger circle is the sun. The Mesopotamians represented the sun god Shamash with rays or with a sun disk, and stars were typically shown as 8-pointed stars. The claim that this seal shows advanced astronomical knowledge is completely unfounded. The Mesopotamians were indeed accomplished astronomers. The Babylonians, especially in the first millennium BCE, developed mathematical astronomy, creating tables that predicted planetary positions and eclipses with impressive accuracy. The astronomical diaries, clay tablets recording daily observations of planetary positions, weather, and significant events, span several centuries. The Babylonian lunar theory, with its sophisticated mathematical models, represents a major achievement in ancient science. But this was observational astronomy, based on careful watching of the night sky over generations, recording patterns, and developing mathematical models to predict those patterns. They observed the planets visible to the naked eye and the moon's phases and eclipses. They developed a calendar that reconciled lunar months with the solar year. This is impressive human achievement, the fruit of centuries of observation and thought. It doesn't require, and the texts don't describe, extraterrestrial instruction. So what were the Anunnaki really building, establishing, creating in the mythological framework of these texts? They were ordaining the fundamental structures of reality. They decreed fate. They judged disputes. They witnessed cosmic events. They formed the divine assembly that made decisions about the cosmos and humanity. In the myths, they participated in creation, not as engineers building physical structures, but as divine powers establishing the patterns that make existence possible. Think of it like this. In Mesopotamian thought, everything that exists does so because it has been named, ordained, given a place in the cosmic order. The Anunnaki, along with the other gods, performed this ordering work in mythological time, in a low tempor, the sacred time of beginnings. Human civilization then operates within this framework, maintaining the patterns through ritual, through proper kingship, through the correct performance of agricultural and social duties. The texts describe a cosmos that is fundamentally ordered, where divine powers maintain structure against chaos. The gods defeated Tiamat, primordial chaos, and created an ordered world. But chaos always threatens at the margins, the wilderness beyond the city, the floodwaters, disease, death. Human effort in partnership with divine power maintains civilization against these forces. This is a sophisticated worldview, and in many ways more interesting than the simplistic ancient aliens narrative, because what we're seeing is humanity in its earliest civilized form grappling with the big questions. How do we explain order and disorder? Why do we suffer? What is our purpose? How should we organize society? The myths about what the Anunnaki established before human civilization are attempts to answer these questions, to root human institutions in cosmic order. The Sumerian concept of me is particularly fascinating because it shows an understanding that civilization is constructed, that the elements of civilized life, law, music, writing, sexuality, warfare, craft, are cultural achievements that can be learned, transferred, and lost. They attributed these ultimately to the gods, but they understood them as a coherent system. Modern archaeology has revealed how this system actually developed. The excavations at sites like Tel Brak, Hamilcar, and Tel al-Ubaid show the development of complexity over millennia. We can see the emergence of social hierarchy in burial goods, some graves with elaborate offerings, others simple. We can trace the development of craft specialization, with workshops for pottery, metalworking, textile production appearing in the archaeological record. We can see the emergence of writing from its precursors. Clay tokens used for counting, impressed clay seal impressions, pictographic tablets, finally full cuneiform. The architecture evolves, from simple reed huts to mud brick houses to large public buildings and temples. Irrigation systems expand, from simple channels watering nearby fields to complex networks of canals managed by central authorities, requiring coordination and administration. This administrative complexity necessitates record keeping, which drives the development of writing. Each step is human achievement, but each step also builds on what came before. The Sumerians didn't invent civilization ex nihilo. They were part of a broader Near Eastern development that included contemporary cultures in Elam, the Levant, and Egypt. They innovated particularly in writing and in the scale of their urban centers, but they were part of a larger human story. And that's what makes this so remarkable. Because when we strip away the ancient alien fantasies, we're left with the reality of human ingenuity, human creativity, human problem-solving on a vast scale. The first cities were human achievements. The invention of writing was a human achievement. The development of mathematics, law, literature, art, human achievements. We don't need ancient astronauts to explain them. Our ancestors were brilliant. The texts themselves show this. When we read Sumerian hymns, lamentations, myths, legal codes, administrative documents, all this vast corpus of cuneiform literature that scholars have been translating for over a century and a half since Rawlinson and Hincks first deciphered the script, we encounter human voices. We hear the concerns of priests maintaining temple rituals, of kings justifying their reigns, of scribes organizing the economy, of poets exploring love and death, of ordinary people worrying about the same things we worry about: family, livelihood, meaning, legacy. There's a Sumerian proverb that says, "A scribe who does not know Sumerian, what kind of scribe is he?" There's a lamentation over the destruction of Ur that describes the city's devastation in heartbreaking detail. The temples abandoned, the streets silent, the people killed or scattered. There's a love song sung by the goddess Inanna about her desire for her husband Dumuzi. There are legal cases about property disputes, marriage contracts, adoptions. These are human documents, full of human concerns. The religious texts, too, for all their mythological content, are deeply human. Their attempts to make sense of a world that could be capricious, where floods destroyed cities, where drought brought famine, where disease struck without warning, where even mighty kings died. The myths about the Anunnaki and the other gods gave pattern and meaning to these experiences. They said, "The cosmos is ordered by divine power. Your suffering has meaning within a larger structure. The rituals you perform maintain the connection between heaven and earth. Your city was founded by divine decree. Your king rules with the gods' blessing. Justice is ordained by the divine assembly." This is religion doing what religion does, providing meaning, structure, and hope. It doesn't require the gods to be literally real in a physical sense to serve these functions. Whether you believe the gods were real spiritual entities or human projections or cultural constructs, what's undeniable is that belief in them shaped one of humanity's first civilizations. The archaeological record shows that Mesopotamian civilization flourished for over 3,000 years. From the first Sumerian cities around 4000 BCE through the Akkadian Empire, the Ur-II period, the Old Babylonian period, the Kassite period, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, down to the conquest by Persia in 539 BCE. This was one of the longest-lasting and most influential civilizations in human history. Its achievements in writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, literature, and art influenced everything that came after in the Western tradition. And throughout this entire span, the myths about the Anunnaki and the other gods provided a framework for understanding the cosmos and humanity's place within it. The myths evolved. The Akkadians adopted and adapted Sumerian traditions, adding their own elements. The Babylonians elevated Marduk to chief god while maintaining the traditional pantheon. The Assyrians emphasized Ashur, but the basic structure remained: a cosmos ordered by divine powers, with humans serving and being served by the gods. When we encounter claims that the Anunnaki were ancient astronauts, that they genetically engineered humanity, that they possessed advanced technology, we need to ask, where's the evidence? Not speculation, not misreadings of texts, not taking mythology literally, actual evidence. And the answer is, there is none. The genetic evidence shows human evolution over millions of years with no sudden interventions. The archaeological evidence shows continuous cultural development with no unexplained leaps. The textual evidence, properly translated, describes a mythological cosmology, not a historical account of alien contact. What we have instead is something more valuable, a window into how our ancestors thought, what they valued, how they made sense of their world. The Sumerian texts are treasures of human thought. They deserve to be read for what they actually say, not twisted to support modern fantasies. Let me leave you with one final text that I think beautifully encapsulates what the Mesopotamians believed about the establishment of order. It's from a Sumerian composition called The Instructions of Shuruppak, one of the oldest wisdom texts in the world, dating to around 2600 BCE. Shuruppak, one of the antediluvian cities, is the father of Ziusudra, the flood hero in the Sumerian version. In this text, he gives advice to his son. Don't steal, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't break into houses. Be honest, be humble, respect the gods. This is moral instruction, ethical teaching. It shows a society thinking about how to live rightly, how to maintain order, how to pass wisdom from generation to generation. The text claims this wisdom ultimately comes from the gods, that proper behavior is ordained by divine decree. But the content is profoundly human. Don't lie, don't cheat, treat others fairly, honor your commitments, respect authority but question abuse of power. The Anunnaki and the other gods in Mesopotamian thought established the cosmic order that makes such wisdom possible. They created a universe where justice, truth, and proper behavior have meaning and consequences. They ordained the patterns that civilization follows. And then humans, created with divine intelligence, carry out the work of maintaining that order through their daily lives. That's what the texts reveal. Not ancient aliens, not genetic engineering, not impossible technology, but something arguably more impressive. Humanity's earliest attempts at philosophy, at ethics, at cosmology, at understanding our place in the universe. The Sumerians looked at the stars and wondered. They looked at their cities and asked how civilization came to be. They contemplated death and sought meaning. And they created myths, rituals, and institutions to embody their answers. Those myths say the Anunnaki built the framework of reality, established the patterns of civilization, decreed the fates that govern the cosmos. In truth, humans built Mesopotamian civilization through thousands of years of innovation, cooperation, and cultural transmission. But the myths served to make that civilization meaningful, to connect human effort to cosmic order, to say, what we do matters. Our cities are sacred. Our work maintains the world. And maybe that's the real lesson we can take from these ancient texts. Not that ancient aliens built civilization for us, but that we built it ourselves. And we told stories to make sense of what we'd accomplished, to pass on wisdom, to inspire the next generation to maintain and improve what they'd inherited. The Anunnaki, in the end, represent human aspiration, the desire to connect our lives to something greater, to live in an ordered cosmos, to make our efforts meaningful. So we've journeyed together tonight through the actual content of the Sumerian texts, through the authentic mythology of the Anunnaki, through the archaeological evidence of how civilization really developed in Mesopotamia. We've seen what the texts genuinely say about divine establishment of cosmic order. We've debunked the mistranslations and misrepresentations that have clouded popular understanding. And we've discovered that the truth is richer, more complex, and more human than the sensational claims. The Anunnaki weren't ancient astronauts from planet Nibiru. They were gods in a sophisticated mythological system that explained cosmic order, divine hierarchy, and humanity's place in the universe. What they built before human civilization began wasn't physical structures but the mythological patterns that made civilization meaningful, the decree of fates, the establishment of me, the ordering of the cosmos. And the real builders of civilization, our ancestors, the Sumerians and their successors who invented writing, built cities, developed law and mathematics and literature, created one of humanity's first and most influential civilizations. They deserve credit for their achievements. And their myths deserve to be read for what they actually say, as windows into ancient thought, as sophisticated theological and philosophical systems, as beautiful literature that still speaks to universal human concerns. The record does not begin with hesitation. It begins already in motion, as if something has resumed rather than started. At Uruk, in the lowest occupational layers where writing first appears, the tablets do not present themselves as tentative marks or experimental symbols. They arrive flattened, ruled, impressed with confidence. The clay is prepared to a consistent thickness. The surfaces are organized into columns and boxes. Signs are repeated with uniform angles and pressure, as though the hand already knows what each mark is meant to represent. There is no visible struggle between idea and execution. The tablet behaves as if it belongs to an established procedure. These earliest tablets, dated to the late 4th millennium BCE, are not narratives. They are records. They count barley, sheep, labor days, vessels, land allotments. They identify offices and roles without explaining them. The signs do not introduce themselves. They assume recognition. There is no indication that the reader is learning a system for the first time. The tablet speaks as though it is being added to an archive that already exists. What is most noticeable is what is absent. There are no transitional forms preserved beneath these tablets. No earlier layers show a gradual development from pictorial marks to abstract signs. No sequence of increasingly refined experiments is visible in the archaeological record. When writing appears, it does so already bound to administration. It is already embedded in accounting. It already assumes authority. The Jemdet Nasser tablets, slightly later in date, reinforce this impression rather than correcting it. They expand the system, introducing more complex sign combinations and clearer numerical conventions. Yet they do not appear to resolve confusion or standardize chaos. Instead, they refine something already functional. The signs vary slightly from site to site, but the structure remains consistent. The tablets still speak the language of offices, deliveries, quotas, and obligations. The scribes who impressed these signs did not describe themselves as inventors. There is no textual self-awareness of novelty. Nowhere does a tablet pause to explain why marks are being pressed into clay. The act is treated as ordinary, necessary, expected. Writing, from its first preserved moment, is already a tool of governance rather than expression. The tools themselves suggest continuity. Styluses used to impress the signs are uniform in size and shape across multiple sites. Clay recipes are consistent. Firing methods are controlled. Tablets are dried and stored deliberately, sometimes stacked, sometimes grouped by category. These are not the habits of improvisation. They suggest training, repetition, and institutional memory. Even the mistakes preserved on some tablets do not feel experimental. Corrections are made cleanly. Signs are overwritten or erased with practiced efficiency. Errors are treated as deviations from a standard, not as discoveries along the way. The scribe knows what the correct form should have been. Some tablets include seal impressions alongside the text. These seals are already carved with complex iconography and titles. Their presence implies authentication, hierarchy, and administrative oversight. Writing is not acting alone. It is embedded within a larger bureaucratic apparatus that assumes continuity beyond any single tablet. Later Sumerian texts refer to writing as something entrusted, guarded, and taught within specific houses of learning. Although these references come centuries after the first tablets, they reflect an attitude that treats writing as inherited knowledge rather than spontaneous creation. The earliest tablets do not contradict this view. They align with it. In this context, writing does not appear as a sudden leap of human creativity sparked by necessity. It appears as the visible surface of something already structured beneath. The tablets behave less like the origin of administration and more like its residue. They suggest that by the time clay was first pressed with signs, systems of measurement, ownership, labor control, and authority were already in operation. This raises a quiet problem for historical sequence. If writing emerges fully aligned with complex administration, where did the administrative logic itself take shape? The tablets do not explain the origin of the offices they record. They do not define the roles they assume. They do not justify the categories they use. They merely apply them. The Anunnaki are not named in these earliest tablets, yet the later tradition that associates them with decrees, destinies, and foundations does not feel incompatible with the administrative tone already present. Authority, in the earliest written record, is treated as something external to the scribe. The scribe records, but does not originate. The tablet obeys a structure that does not announce its maker. The physical context reinforces this restraint. These tablets are found in spaces associated with temples and central storage facilities. Writing appears where redistribution occurs, where surplus is measured and reassigned. It is not found in domestic settings at this stage. It belongs to institutions, not individuals. The voice of the tablet is impersonal. If civilization is measured by writing, then civilization here does not awaken gradually. It resumes. The first tablet does not speak of beginnings. It speaks as if something is being maintained. And if the earliest written signs already assume shared meanings, standardized forms, and institutional authority, then the question quietly shifts. Before the first tablet was pressed, who already knew what these signs meant, and how was that knowledge held in memory before it entered the clay? If the meanings of the first signs were already known before they were fixed into clay, then the question does not remain confined to writing alone. It extends into the language that those signs were meant to carry. Sumerian enters the record without relatives. From the moment it can be read with confidence, it resists placement among surrounding tongues. It does not behave like an early form of Akkadian, Elamite, or any later Semitic or Indo-European language. Its grammar follows different rules. Its structure is agglutinative, layering meaning through suffixes and particles in a way that does not echo the linguistic landscape that would later surround it. For the scribe, this was not a problem to be solved. It was simply the language of record. The earliest readable Sumerian inscriptions already display a mature grammatical system. Nouns are marked for case. Verbs carry information about subject, object, tense, and modality. Possession is expressed with precision. Administrative roles are encoded in consistent linguistic forms. There is no visible stage where these elements are tentative or unstable. The language does not search for balance. It operates within it. This absence of linguistic ancestry is not framed as unusual within the texts themselves. Scribes did not pause to explain the origins of their language. They did not treat it as new or provisional. Later lexical lists, compiled for training purposes, present Sumerian signs paired with Akkadian equivalents. These lists assume that Sumerian is already complete enough to require translation, not explanation. The learner is expected to adapt to the language, not watch it form. In these lexical texts, Sumerian appears as a closed system. Words are cataloged, grouped by semantic fields, professions, objects, and actions. This act of classification implies that the language is no longer evolving in unpredictable ways. It is being preserved, transmitted, and mastered. The lists themselves are careful, repetitive, and conservative, as if designed to protect something from alteration. Phonetic values, though reconstructed imperfectly today, were treated as stable by the scribes. Signs could represent sounds, ideas, or categories depending on context, yet the rules governing these shifts are consistent. Such flexibility usually emerges over long periods of use, shaped by convention and memory rather than invention. The language behaves as though it has already lived a long internal history before it appears in writing. Even the vocabulary carries this impression. Terms for administration, agriculture, irrigation, and labor organization are numerous and specific. There are words for offices that presuppose hierarchies. There are verbs that assume coordinated activity. The language does not struggle to describe its world. It appears already suited to it. When Akkadian-speaking scribes later adopted cuneiform, they treated Sumerian with a particular kind of respect. It became a learned language, used in ritual, scholarship, and formal inscriptions long after it ceased to be spoken conversationally. This suggests that Sumerian was perceived as foundational, not merely old. It was preserved because it carried authority, not nostalgia. The scribes themselves seemed aware that they were handling something inherited. Colophons sometimes identify a tablet as a faithful copy of an older source. Accuracy is emphasized. Deviations are corrected. The concern is not creativity but continuity. Language here is not a space for experimentation. It is a vessel. The isolation of Sumerian has often been treated as a historical puzzle. Yet from within the record, isolation is not acknowledged. The language does not announce itself as unique. It does not defend its difference. It simply functions. This silence may suggest that, for its users, Sumerian was not an innovation emerging among neighbors, but a received system that defined its own space. If language is shaped by social memory, then a language that appears already structured implies a memory already in place. The scribes do not record the moment when Sumerian began. They record moments when it is applied. The origin remains outside the frame, as if it belongs to a time not meant for documentation. Later traditions would associate the ordering of language, names, and decrees with divine authority. The Anunnaki, when mentioned in these contexts, are linked to decisions and foundations rather than speech itself. Language is treated as something regulated, not created. Its legitimacy does not come from invention, but from alignment with an established order. The absence of linguistic ancestors, then, may not signal sudden emergence. It may indicate that the ancestors were never written down, or that they belonged to a context where writing was unnecessary. If so, the appearance of Sumerian in clay would mark not the birth of language, but the moment it was committed to record. And if the first written language already carried centuries of internal structure, preserved rather than developed on the tablet, then where had that structure been maintained before it was fixed into signs, and under whose authority was it kept? If language was preserved as a closed system rather than shaped in public view, authority appears to have followed a similar path. The earliest political records do not describe leadership forming through negotiation or struggle. They describe it as already assigned. The Sumerian king list does not open with a founding moment. It opens with a transfer. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. The phrase is not framed as poetry. It is treated as a procedural statement, marking the beginning of a sequence rather than an explanation. Kingship is not said to be invented, chosen, or claimed. It is said to descend, as though it existed elsewhere before it arrived among cities. The list itself is administrative in character. It names rulers, assigns them reign lengths, and moves authority from city to city with a quiet regularity. The language is formulaic. Each entry follows the same pattern, suggesting compilation rather than composition. The scribe is not telling a story. He is maintaining a record. The earliest portion of the list assigns extraordinarily long reigns to the first kings. These figures are often discussed as symbolic, yet within the document they are not treated differently from later, shorter reigns. There is no distinction in tone, no marker that one section is myth and another history. The structure remains consistent, implying that the list is less concerned with plausibility than with continuity. What matters in the king list is not the character of the kings, but the movement of kingship itself. Authority migrates from Eridu to Bad Tabira, to Larak, to Sippar, to Shurapak. Cities are not said to conquer one another. Kingship is said to be transferred. This language implies an external source of legitimacy, something that can be relocated without conflict, as though by decree. Later administrative texts reinforce this idea. Kings present themselves not as founders but as caretakers. Inscriptions speak of restoring temples, re-establishing rights, and returning order after disruption. Even when a king boasts, the boast is framed as service. He carries out what was assigned. He does not claim to originate it. The phrase descended from heaven does not require interpretation as a supernatural event. Within the administrative mindset of the scribes, it functions as a marker of origin beyond dispute. Heaven, in this context, is a source of authorization that does not need to be defined. It is sufficient that it is above the human realm. Kingship is legitimate because it is not generated locally. This perspective aligns with how offices are treated in economic texts. Titles appear without explanation. Roles exist before the individuals who fill them. A man becomes an ensi or a lugal by occupying a position that already carries authority. The office precedes the office holder. Power is inherited structurally, not constructed personally. The king list also omits certain rulers known from archaeology. Its purpose is not completeness but order. It selects and arranges names to maintain a continuous line of authority. Breaks are acknowledged only when unavoidable, such as after the flood, which is treated as an interruption rather than a reset. Kingship resumes. It does not restart. The flood itself is not described in detail in the list. It functions as a boundary. Before it, kingship descends and circulates. After it, kingship descends again and continues. The implication is that even catastrophe does not abolish authority. It suspends it, preserving it for return. Later copies of the king list show careful transmission. Variants exist, but the core structure remains stable. This suggests that scribes regarded the document as foundational. It was not updated freely. It was copied with restraint. Its authority lay in its age and continuity, not its adaptability. In this administrative worldview, the Anunnaki appear not as rulers on the list, but as the ones associated with decrees, destinies, and the fixing of order. Kingship descends, but its origin remains above the human register. The king administers what has been allotted. He does not redefine it. This conception of power affects how cities are understood. A city does not rise because a king builds it. A king reigns because kingship arrives there. The city becomes significant by hosting authority, not by generating it. Political centrality follows legitimacy, not the other way around. If kingship is treated as something that moves intact from place to place, then political organization is not a human experiment unfolding over time. It is a framework that appears complete, disrupted only by disaster, and restored according to precedent. And if authority itself was remembered as descending already formed, then when the earliest cities took shape around that authority, were they designed to create power, or to receive something that had already been defined elsewhere? If authority was understood as something that arrived already defined, then the spaces built to host it appear to have been prepared in much the same way. The earliest cities do not read as improvisations. They appear as settings arranged in advance for functions that were already known. At Uruk, the archaeological layers reveal a city that expands rapidly, yet not haphazardly. Streets follow repeated orientations. Districts cluster around central precincts. Buildings align with one another across phases of reconstruction. Even where walls are rebuilt, the footprints are respected. This continuity suggests that the city was not discovering its form through trial, but maintaining a layout that carried prior meaning. The Ina precinct, one of the earliest monumental complexes at Uruk, does not grow organically outward from a single structure. It appears instead as a coordinated ensemble of buildings, courtyards, and open spaces. Construction phases replace earlier phases without altering the underlying plan. Walls are thickened, surfaces refined, but alignments persist. The builders behave as custodians of a design rather than authors of a new one. Eridu presents a similar pattern. Beneath the later temple mound lies a sequence of superimposed structures, each rebuilt directly atop the previous. The orientation remains stable across centuries. The repetition is precise enough to suggest deliberate memory. Builders did not simply choose a convenient spot. They return to the same lines, the same axis, as though deviation was not an option. Domestic architecture also reflects restraint. Houses vary in size, but they follow recognizable patterns. Courtyards are positioned consistently. Entrances respect street alignments. Drainage systems are integrated rather than added later. These features do not appear as solutions discovered through failure. They appear as conventions applied from the outset. The streets themselves reinforce this impression. At Uruk, some thoroughfares curve gently, responding to topography, while others run straight toward institutional zones. The balance suggests planning within constraint, not disorder. Movement through the city channels people toward administrative and ritual centers. The city directs behavior without announcing its intention. What is striking is the lack of transitional urban forms. There is little evidence of scattered hamlets gradually merging into a dense cityscape. Instead, large-scale organization appears early. Storage facilities, workshops, and residential zones coexist from the beginning. The city functions as a system rather than an accumulation. Construction techniques support this reading. Mud brick sizes are standardized. Brick bonds repeat across sites. Foundation methods are consistent. Such regularity implies shared knowledge transmitted among builders. This knowledge does not advertise itself as new. It is applied quietly as if expected. In administrative text, cities are treated as fixed entities. They are named, counted, and ranked. Their boundaries are assumed. The texts do not describe the founding of cities in architectural terms. They describe the transfer of authority to them. A city becomes central when kingship arrives there, not when walls are raised. This relationship between authority and space suggests that cities were conceived as receptacles. They were designed to receive institutions, not to invent them. The city does not explain itself through its form. Its form assumes prior functions: storage, redistribution, ritual, judgment. Later rebuilding episodes reinforce continuity rather than change. When destruction occurs, reconstruction follows earlier lines. This is not because alternatives were unknown, but because deviation would disrupt alignment with inherited order. The city's plan is treated as something that must be restored. The Anunnaki, when referenced in building inscriptions, are associated with foundations and decrees rather than design choices. Builders dedicate structures according to prescriptions, not inspiration. The act of building is framed as fulfillment. The city is not an experiment. It is an obligation. From an archaeological perspective, this creates a problem of sequence. Urban planning usually leaves behind traces of correction and adaptation. At Uruk and Eridu, those traces are minimal. The earliest phases already exhibit coherence. The city behaves as though it remembers where its walls should stand. If writing records administration and kingship records authority, then the city appears as the physical memory that holds both. Its layout stabilizes behavior across generations. Streets guide movement long after the planners are gone. Walls preserve hierarchy without explanation. In this sense, the city is not merely built. It is maintained. Its plan is not debated. It is respected. The builders act less like designers and more like restorers, returning form to something already established. And if the earliest cities were arranged to receive authority rather than generate it, then what architectural element came first as the fixed point of memory beneath these plans, anchoring the city before walls, streets, and institutions rose around it? If the city's plan anchored itself around a fixed point of memory, archaeology suggests that this point was not originally a temple, but something quieter and more restrained beneath it. At sites such as Eridu, Uruk, and excavation has revealed a recurring pattern beneath later monumental temples. Before walls rose high and facades were articulated, there were platforms. These early constructions are modest in height, carefully leveled and deliberately placed. They do not announce themselves as buildings meant to be entered. They are surfaces, raised slightly above the surrounding ground, set apart by elevation rather than enclosure. At Eridu, the deepest levels show a sequence of superimposed platforms long before the appearance of a true temple plan. Each layer is rebuilt directly atop the previous one, preserving orientation and footprint. The builders did not expand outward or alter alignment. They added height, not complexity. The act is repetitive, careful, and conservative. Whatever the platform marked, its position was not negotiable. These early platforms lack the features usually associated with later sacred architecture. There are no cult statues, no interior rooms, no monumental stairways. Yet they occupy the most central and protected location in the settlement. Domestic structures respect their presence. Activity zones curve around them. The platform does not serve the city organizes itself around the platform. The materials used reinforce the impression of deliberate restraint. Mud brick is laid in regular courses. Surfaces are smoothed and maintained. Repairs follow original lines rather than introducing improvement. The builders seem less concerned with visibility than with continuity. The platform's importance does not depend on display. Administrative texts from later periods refer to temple foundations as ancient, established in a distant past. When kings rebuild sanctuaries, they emphasize returning them to their original condition. The language used is restorative. The implication is that the sacred location predates the current structure. The building is temporary. The place is permanent. This distinction between place and structure appears repeatedly. At Uruk, beneath the later Ina temples, earlier platforms align with the same axis as the monumental buildings above them. Even as architecture grows more elaborate, it remains bound to an inherited footprint. The builders do not reinterpret the sacred center. They elaborate upon it. From an archaeological standpoint, these platforms are difficult to classify. They are too deliberate to be accidental, yet too minimal to be functional buildings. They do not store goods. They do not house activity. They mark something rather than contain it. Elevation alone distinguishes them. Later texts describe temples as houses of the gods, but the earliest platforms do not behave like houses. They are closer to bases, stages, or foundations without superstructure. Their purpose may not have been to shelter a presence, but to designate a location where something was acknowledged. The repetition of rebuilding suggests that the platform's meaning outlasted any single generation. Floods, subsidence, or decay would have required repair, yet the response was always to rebuild in place. The memory of where the platform belonged was preserved even when its surface disappeared. This practice aligns with how Sumerian builders understood legitimacy. A structure derived authority from alignment with what came before. Innovation risked rupture. Restoration maintained order. The platform, in this sense, functioned as a reference point against which correctness could be measured. The Anunnaki are not explicitly associated with these early platforms in the archaeological record. Yet later inscriptions link divine authority to foundations, decrees, and fixed points. When builders dedicate later temples, they invoke permissions and destinies rather than design choices. The sacred center is treated as something already sanctioned. The absence of explicit explanation in the earliest layers is telling. The platform does not explain itself through inscription or iconography. It is silent. Its significance is assumed rather than declared. Those who rebuilt it did not feel the need to justify its presence. They behaved as though its meaning was already known. If the earliest sacred spaces were defined by location rather than structure, then the emergence of temples may represent not the beginning of worship, but its architectural formalization. The platform would then be the preserved memory of a function that preceded walls and roofs. This reading suggests a sequence in which meaning comes first, architecture second. The sacred is fixed, then gradually enclosed. The builders do not invent the center, they recognize it. The platform is the trace of that recognition. And if the earliest raised platforms marked places of authority or allocation rather than habitation, then before temples took form around them, who determined what these platforms represented, and how was that determination administered? If the earliest sacred places were marked without explanation, then the names later associated with authority may also have functioned without spectacle. In the administrative record, the Anunnaki do not arrive as characters in a story. They appear as terms within a system. In lexical lists, where scribes organize the world into categories for instruction and reference, the Anunnaki are placed among groups rather than set apart as unique beings. They are listed alongside offices, ranks, and assemblies. The ordering is deliberate. Names are not grouped by narrative importance but by function. In this context, the Anunnaki are treated as a collective with defined scope, not as individual personalities. Administrative tablets sometimes reference allocations, offerings, or responsibilities associated with divine groups. When the Anunnaki are named, they appear as recipients within established accounting frameworks. Quantities are measured, deliveries are recorded. The language does not pause to describe who they are. It assumes that their role within the system is already understood. This treatment differs noticeably from later literary compositions, where the Anunnaki are given voices, actions, and genealogies. In administrative contexts, none of this appears. There is no drama. There is no narrative sequence. The Anunnaki function as fixed points within bureaucratic language, much like institutions or councils. The term itself is not explained in these records. Lexical lists provide equivalences and classifications, but not definitions. This suggests that the scribes did not consider the Anunnaki to be obscure or symbolic. They were part of the accepted administrative vocabulary. Their meaning did not require elaboration. In some texts, the Anunnaki are associated with decrees, destinies, or judgments. These associations align closely with administrative concepts. A decree fixes procedure. A destiny assigns outcome. A judgment resolves allocation. The language overlaps with the concerns of governance rather than worship. Offerings to the Anunnaki are recorded with the same precision as those to specific temples or officials. There is no indication that these offerings are exceptional. They are scheduled, measured, and accounted for. The process treats the Anunnaki as participants in the redistribution system that structured the economy. The absence of temples dedicated exclusively to the Anunnaki is notable. While later texts speak of their assembly, archaeology does not clearly identify a central cult space associated with them. This absence aligns with their administrative portrayal. They are not localized. They are not housed. They operate across the system rather than within a single structure. Scribes working within this framework appear less concerned with belief than with alignment. To name the Anunnaki in a record is to acknowledge a layer of authority that stands above the immediate transaction. It situates the action within a larger order. The tablet does not appeal to emotion or devotion. It records compliance. This bureaucratic handling suggests that the Anunnaki were treated as guarantors of structure. Their presence in the text stabilizes meaning. It signals that what is being recorded conforms to an established framework that predates the individual scribe or king. Later kings, when invoking the Anunnaki in inscriptions, do so to legitimize actions rather than to narrate encounters. They claim to act according to decrees set by these figures. The Anunnaki do not advise, they authorize. Their function is static rather than interactive. From this perspective, the Anunnaki resemble an administrative abstraction more than a pantheon of active agents. They embody continuity. They represent the persistence of order across generations. Their authority does not need renewal because it is assumed to be permanent. This reading does not deny their divinity within Sumerian thought. It reframes how divinity operated within the record. The divine here is not primarily expressive. It is regulatory. It exists to ensure that systems remain aligned with their original configuration. If the Anunnaki were understood as administrators of order rather than actors within history, then their presence in the earliest records reflects concern with maintenance rather than origin. They do not explain how systems came into being. They ensure that those systems continue to function as intended. This raises a subtle implication. If order was already established and required administration rather than invention, then the earliest measures of that order would need to be precise and consistent. And if such precision appears early in the record, then where did the standards that governed it come from, and how long had they been in use before they were written down? If order was maintained through fixed standards, then those standards themselves become part of the record that demands attention. The earliest tablets do not merely count, they measure with consistency. From the first administrative texts, quantities are expressed through a numerical system that already assumes agreement. The sexagesimal structure appears immediately, dividing and multiplying with a logic that does not require explanation within the text. Units are applied without definition. The tablet does not pause to clarify how much grain fills a sela, or how many sela compose a gore. These relationships are assumed to be known before the stylus touches the clay. Physical evidence supports this assumption. Excavations have recovered stone and metal weights from early contexts, shaped and sized with careful regularity. Many conform to recognizable ratios. When tested, their mass clusters tightly around expected values. Variation exists, but it falls within limits that suggest calibration rather than approximation. These objects were not improvised. They were produced to match something already agreed upon. The distribution of such weights across sites is revealing. Similar units appear at Uruk, and other early centers. This implies coordination beyond a single workshop or city. Either standards traveled with administrators, or administrators recognized standards that were already in circulation. In both cases, the system precedes the individual transaction. Numerical tablets often record complex operations. Fractions are used confidently. Multiplication and division are implied through layout rather than stated explicitly. The arrangement of numbers on the tablet reflects shared conventions about how values relate to one another. The scribe does not explain his method, he applies it. In later periods, mathematical tablets show instruction and problem solving, but these are framed as exercises within an established tradition. They do not claim to invent techniques, they rehearse them. The teacher corrects errors against a known solution. The student is trained to remember, not to discover. Measurement extends beyond trade. Land is surveyed using fixed units. Fields are described in terms of length, width, and area, expressed through standardized measures. These descriptions appear in legal and administrative contexts, suggesting that disputes were resolved by reference to shared metrics. The measure itself carries authority. Time, too, is divided according to regular schemes. Months are counted, years are named, cycles are recognized. Though later texts elaborate calendrical systems, the early records already treat time as something that can be segmented and accounted for. Obligations are scheduled, deliveries are due. The system assumes predictability. The language of these tablets suggests that measurement was treated as neutral. Numbers do not persuade, they settle. A quantity recorded on clay is final. The authority of the record depends on the stability of the units it employs. If those units were contested, the record would lose force. The Anunnaki, when associated with decrees and destinies, occupy a conceptual space that aligns with this stability. Destinies are fixed, decrees are binding. In this framework, measures are not conveniences. They are expressions of order. To measure correctly is to align with what has been allotted. Later hymns and inscriptions sometimes credit divine authority with establishing measures and boundaries. While these texts are not administrative, they reflect an attitude that treats measurement as foundational. The king restores correct weights and measures as part of maintaining justice. Corruption is described as deviation from standard, not innovation. Archaeologically, there is little evidence of experimentation with alternative systems in the earliest phases. We do not see competing measures gradually resolving into one. Instead, we see a dominant system applied broadly. Adjustments occur over time, but the core structure persists. This persistence suggests memory. Standards must be learned, transmitted, and enforced. They require institutions that remember correct values even when individual practitioners err. The early appearance of such standards implies that these institutions were already functioning. If measurement systems were inherited, then their origin lies outside the earliest written record. The tablets capture their application, not their creation. The weights embody agreement, but they do not explain how agreement was first reached. The quiet efficiency of these systems contrasts with the fragility of the material they are written on. Clay breaks, weights corrode, yet the system continues. It is reasserted with each transaction, each survey, each delivery. Memory is renewed through use. In this light, mathematics in early Sumer is not an abstract pursuit. It is a method of preservation. It keeps relationships stable across time and space. It allows authority to function without constant negotiation. If such precision governed land, goods, and obligations from the beginning, then the same concern for regularity may have extended beyond the ground. And if measures fixed what could be counted and divided, what framework fixed the cycles that could only be observed, and who first aligned them with number? If number fixed what could be counted on the ground, then the same numerical calm appears when attention lifts upward. The earliest records that touch the sky do not read like notes from first-time observers. They read like applications of an already agreed frame. In the administrative and ritual calendars of early Sumer, celestial references appear without narrative introduction. Months are tied to recurring sky events. Offerings are scheduled according to cycles that assume regular return. The tablet does not describe watching the heavens to see what might happen. It assigns duties as though outcomes are expected. Temple architecture quietly reinforces this assumption. At Uruk and later at Ur and Lagash, major sacred buildings align with consistent cardinal directions. The precision varies, but the intention is clear. Walls are not oriented casually. Axes repeat across rebuilding phases, even when practical considerations would allow adjustment. Builders preserve alignment as carefully as they preserve foundations. These orientations are not explained in inscriptions. No text accompanies the wall to justify its direction. The alignment is treated as self-evident. It belongs to the correctness of the structure, much like proper measurement or proper nomming. Deviation would require explanation. Conformity does not. Later astronomical tablets, though more explicit, still reflect this inherited posture. Star lists catalog constellations and stellar groupings with stable names and sequences. The language implies recognition rather than discovery. Stars are identified by function and position within a system, not by appearance. The sky is already organized. Some of these lists arrange stars along paths associated with months or deities. The divisions are regular. They do not attempt to reconcile irregular motion or unexpected variation. The system privileges order over anomaly. It suggests that what matters is not observation in the moment, but adherence to a framework that smooths observation into predictability. The same attitude appears in omen literature that references celestial events. While these texts are interpretive, they rely on established correspondences. An eclipse or unusual conjunction is significant precisely because it disrupts expectation. The expectation itself must therefore be stable and widely shared. Without a known order, deviation would carry no meaning. Archaeological evidence for early observation tools is sparse. There are no preserved instruments from the earliest phases that clearly function as devices for systematic skywatching. Yet the architectural and textual records imply knowledge precise enough to guide construction and scheduling. The absence of tools does not align easily with the presence of applied knowledge. This gap suggests that observation may not have been localized to the period when writing began. Knowledge of cycles could have been accumulated earlier and then preserved through instruction rather than repeated measurement. Once encoded into ritual and architecture, it would no longer require constant verification. The Anunnaki appear in later texts as figures associated with decrees that encompass both earthly and cosmic order. When destinies are fixed, they include timing. Days are favorable or unfavorable, periods open and close. While these texts are not technical astronomy, they reflect an understanding that time and sky operate under regulation rather than chance. Kings who renovate temples often claim to restore correct alignments and observances. The language is conservative. A misaligned structure is corrected, not improved. The king does not claim insight into the heavens. He claims fidelity to what was already established. In this environment, astronomical knowledge functions as background infrastructure. It supports agriculture, ritual, and administration without drawing attention to itself. The sky is not a mystery to be solved, but a schedule to be followed. The lack of an observational history within the record is therefore notable. We do not see early debates about where to place a wall relative to the sun or how to divide the year. Those decisions are already embedded in practice. They are remembered through repetition rather than explained through text. If the earliest builders aligned structures according to inherited sky knowledge, then architecture becomes a form of memory. Each wall preserves a decision made earlier, perhaps long before the wall itself was raised. The city becomes a record of the sky, written in brick rather than clay. This reading does not require advanced calculation beyond the reach of early society. It requires continuity. It requires that once a cycle was recognized and fixed, it was taught, repeated, and respected. The sky, once ordered, remained ordered through human adherence. And if the earliest calendars and alignments reflect a sky already divided into meaningful segments, then before the first temple was oriented, and the first month named, who established the initial correspondence between number, structure, and the movement above, and how was that correspondence preserved long enough to reach the builders who followed it? If the sky was treated as a regulated system whose cycles could be trusted, then the same expectation of order appears when attention turns inward, toward the human body. The earliest medical tablets do not read like records of experimentation. They read like applications of a known method. In the oldest diagnostic and therapeutic texts, ailments are classified with consistency. Symptoms are listed in sequences that imply expectation rather than discovery. A condition begins in a particular way, progresses through recognizable stages, and is met with a prescribed response. The tablet does not ask what the illness might be. It identifies it. These texts are not speculative. They do not debate causes or test alternatives. They state correlations. If a patient presents with a certain pattern of pain, swelling, or fever, then a corresponding procedure follows. The language is conditional but not uncertain. The structure resembles a reference manual more than a field notebook. What is notable is the absence of pedagogical framing. There are no introductory explanations of anatomy or physiology. The scribe does not describe learning how the body works. The tablet assumes that the reader already understands the basic map. Instructions focus on application rather than theory. Remedies themselves are standardized. Ingredients recur across tablets. Quantities are specified using established measures. Preparation methods are repeated with little variation. This consistency suggests shared training, yet there is no clear archaeological evidence for early medical schools or institutions dedicated solely to instruction. The practitioners named in some texts are identified by titles rather than personal attributes. They act within roles. Their authority derives from position, not innovation. Treatment is carried out according to precedent. Success depends on correct adherence rather than creative insight. Diagnostic texts sometimes distinguish between conditions attributed to physical causes and those associated with other agencies. Yet even here, the response is procedural. Ritual elements, when present, are integrated into treatment schedules with the same regularity as physical remedies. The system accommodates multiple explanations without altering its structure. Later medical compilations preserve earlier formulations with minimal change. Copyists reproduce signs carefully. Variants are rare and often corrected. This conservatism suggests that medical knowledge was regarded as something that could be degraded by alteration. Preservation mattered more than revision. The absence of recorded debate is striking. We do not see early physicians arguing over interpretations. We see agreement enforced through repetition. The tablets imply that correct diagnosis was a matter of memory and training rather than insight. This approach aligns with the broader administrative culture. Just as measures and calendars regulate goods and time, medical texts regulate care. The body is treated as another domain governed by established order. Illness disrupts that order. Treatment restores it. The Anunnaki, when mentioned in later medical contexts, are not healers in the personal sense. They are associated with decrees that affect life and fate. Health, in this view, is not negotiated. It is allotted and, when disturbed, corrected according to rule. Archaeologically, tools associated with medical practice are difficult to isolate. Knives, containers, and implements are indistinguishable from those used in other crafts. This suggests that medical knowledge was embedded within broader professional practice rather than separated into a distinct institution. If so, then learning would have occurred through apprenticeship and transmission within households or temples. Knowledge would pass quietly, maintained through repetition rather than formal instruction. The tablet becomes the anchor that stabilizes memory across generations. The early appearance of such systematized medicine raises questions about origin. A body of knowledge extensive enough to classify symptoms and prescribe treatments does not form overnight. Yet the record captures it already formed. The tablets do not explain how understanding accumulated. They record how it was used. This pattern mirrors what appears elsewhere. Writing, measurement, astronomy, and now medicine all enter the record as mature systems. Each functions within a framework that prioritizes continuity. Each assumes that correct procedure is already known. If the body was understood through inherited patterns rather than ongoing experimentation, then care itself becomes a matter of compliance. The healer restores balance by following established paths, not by discovering new ones. And if such intimate knowledge of the body was governed by precedent rather than debate, then how were disputes over responsibility, error, or harm resolved when treatment failed? And what system existed to judge correctness when life itself was at stake? If the body could be treated as a system of predictable patterns, then society itself appears in the earliest records as similarly ordered. The tablets preserve not only transactions and measurements, but also expectations of behavior, encoded in statements that resemble law before any formal courtroom existed. Early Sumerian tablets record disputes, fines, and obligations with remarkable precision. They describe the theft of grain, the damage of property, or the misallocation of labor, often specifying restitution or compensation in terms of standard measures. The language does not appeal to judges or debate. It asserts outcomes as if the rules themselves were immutable. The scribe assumes that all parties understand the framework that governs action and consequence. These legal formulations appear in administrative contexts rather than dedicated legal codices. There is no evidence of a separate court structure at this stage. Decisions are inscribed alongside inventories, contracts, and offerings. Justice is embedded within the record-keeping system, inseparable from the broader functioning of the city. To follow the law is to comply with order itself. The earliest examples do not explain why a particular action is wrong. Instead, they record what must be done to restore equilibrium. If a canal is blocked, restitution is demanded. If a servant absconds, compensation is recorded. The focus is on maintaining balance and continuity rather than adjudicating guilt or interpreting motive. The law functions as a mechanism of preservation. Titles and roles are referenced, but rarely in the manner of adjudicators. The authority behind the law is assumed rather than elaborated. Kings, officials, and scribes enforce compliance, but the text treats their authority as inherited or established, not generated through debate. The system functions because participants recognize its legitimacy as pre-existing. Tablet fragments from Ur, Lagesh, and Nippur show that agreements were witnessed and sealed with signs, not by recitation before assemblies. The tablet itself, not the presence of an adjudicator, records the act. The act of writing constitutes recognition. Justice is codified materially. The record stabilizes the decision across space and time. Punishments and compensations are calculated according to the same standard measures used for trade and rationing. A stolen herd is repaid in sela of grain or livestock. Penalties are proportional according to conventions rather than individual discretion. This approach links law directly to the infrastructure of measurement and administration. Order is maintained through predictable correspondence between act and remedy. Some tablets include procedural instructions, specifying how claims should be presented, witnesses counted, or agreements witnessed. These instructions imply practice without the need for an institution to interpret them. The system anticipates dispute resolution by encoding expectations into the record itself. Compliance does not rely on judgment in the abstract. It relies on correct application of precedent. References to the Anunnaki in early legal contexts are subtle but meaningful. These figures are invoked not as enforcers in the human courtroom, but as guarantors of order. Laws are treated as extensions of a cosmic or divine framework. Following the codified procedure aligns human action with a higher order, preserving consistency and legitimacy across generations. The divine authority, in this sense, underwrites the record rather than acting as an intervening agent. Even where later courts emerge, the earliest codifications remain remarkably stable. Revisions occur, but the structure is preserved. This implies that the early formulations were treated as foundational. The system does not invent new categories of justice. It perpetuates the existing ones. The codification predates institution, suggesting that law was remembered before it was enacted. This orientation toward preservation over innovation aligns with other spheres: numbers, measures, medical procedures, and astronomical observation. Each relies on memory and repetition rather than experimentation. Law functions the same way. The tablet is the guarantor, the measure, and the reminder. Authority derives from consistency rather than negotiation. If justice is recorded before formal courts, then the city itself functions as a system of distributed enforcement. The record embodies responsibility, and compliance is maintained by reference to the text rather than by the presence of adjudicators. The law exists materially and socially simultaneously. And if codified law precedes the courtroom, then who determined the original standards of fairness? And how were these principles preserved long enough to guide action when no institution yet existed to enforce them? If law and order existed before formal institutions, then the land itself preserves traces of abrupt interruptions that test continuity. Excavations at Ur, Eridu, and Kish reveal layers of silt and sediment that mark episodes of intense flooding. Sedimentation so sudden that entire buildings were buried without evidence of reconstruction for generations. These layers are treated in the record not as incidental, but as points of reference. The stratigraphy at these early sites is remarkably clear. Archaeologists note abrupt transitions between habitation surfaces and flood deposits. Pottery, tools, and even administrative tablets are sometimes pressed into the mud, preserved in situ. The sediment provides a record of interruption, but it also preserves what came before. Items buried in these layers remain identifiable, as if the flood itself acted as a conservator of memory, freezing both activity and pause. Textual references to floods appear in later compilations, often described as sweeping away cities or altering landscapes. Yet the earliest administrative tablets and inscriptions do not narrate catastrophe. They do not describe witnessing or surviving. Instead, the later accounts assume that such events were part of a sequence already known. Locations are referred to as formerly inhabited or reclaimed, implying that memory predates the written narrative. Some excavated flood layers correspond approximately with what later texts record, while others show no clear textual counterpart. This mismatch raises questions about how events were preserved in memory. Sediment, of course, is impartial. It records what occurred physically. The text records what is remembered, selected, or sanctioned for continuity. Alignment is partial, suggesting that the historical record is mediated by function rather than chronology. In certain cases, temples and platforms built atop flood layers demonstrate deliberate reconstruction. Builders did not discard prior foundations, they incorporated them. A ziggurat erected after inundation may rest on an earlier platform, sometimes with inscriptions noting the restoration of order. These reconstructions treat the flood not merely as disruption, but as a layer within an ongoing administrative and ritual sequence. Memory and rebuilding coexist physically. The pattern of settlement interruption also reflects social priorities. Domestic areas may be abandoned for decades, while civic or religious structures are repaired first. This implies that continuity is selective. What is preserved and restored is treated as essential to the functioning of the city and its institutions, rather than as a comprehensive record of all human activity. Textual traces complement the physical record in subtle ways. Temple inventories occasionally note missing offerings or gaps in accountancy, hinting at periods when records could not be maintained. Scribes mark sequences as interrupted, using phrases that imply restoration rather than creation. These annotations suggest awareness that continuity is not absolute, yet that preservation is essential. Flood layers also intersect with measurement and astronomical systems. Surveys and orientations sometimes resume from pre-flood reference points, rather than establishing new baselines. Builders treat earlier alignment as authoritative, even when the material has been disturbed. This practice implies a respect for inherited systems that extends across both space and time. Knowledge, once established, remains a reference point even when interrupted by natural events. The Anunnaki, when mentioned in relation to waters or divine decrees, appear as guarantors of order beyond the capacity of human intervention. Floods are interpreted not as chaos without precedent, but as events with recognized place within cosmic and civic order. The record implies that disruption is temporary, measured, and ultimately reconcilable with pre-existing structures. Yet the stratigraphic evidence also highlights gaps. Not all flood events are mentioned in the textual record. Some layers contain items without parallel memory. Entire neighborhoods vanish without explanation. This raises the question of what was considered worthy of preservation and what could be forgotten. Archaeology reveals absence as clearly as presence, suggesting that memory was selective and codified even as it was maintained. If cities could rebuild atop flood layers while maintaining inherited measures, alignments, and records, then physical and textual memory function together to stabilize civilization. The land preserves what the scribe records, and the scribe records what the city preserves. Continuity is thus both fragile and deliberate, negotiated between material sediment and structured memory. And if layers of water can interrupt habitations, yet leave foundations and records intact, then what systems of transmission ensured that knowledge, order, and practice survived these interruptions long enough to be recognized as continuous by later generations? If the city could survive floods and maintain alignment, measures, and records, then the system that recorded all of this, writing itself, must also have been established with remarkable consistency. The earliest tablets from Uruk and Jemdet Nasser show signs of precision, clarity, and standardization that suggest the presence of fully trained scribes. Yet the problem arises: where is the evidence of the first scribe, or of the stages through which scribal knowledge developed? The tablets do not contain apprenticeship manuals in the modern sense. They do not chronicle the experiments of novices learning signs for the first time. Instead, the earliest administrative texts display uniformity in sign formation, numerical notation, and layout conventions. The clay shows careful stylus work, the arrangement of columns follows agreed patterns, and the counting system is consistently applied. From the outset, scribes appear as if trained by a fully operational institution. Archaeological evidence provides partial insight. Scribal schools, known as Edubba in later periods, are absent from the earliest strata. Excavations at Uruk reveal rooms with benches and small tablets, suggesting spaces for instruction, but these belong to the same period in which fully developed tablets appear. There are no preceding layers containing rudimentary tablets or experimental writings. The record captures the product of training without preserving its origins. The lexical lists of signs and their values, further complicate the picture. These lists are already organized, pairing signs with sounds, objects, or numerical values. They suggest that scribes were instructed to memorize and apply a pre-existing system. The lists do not teach discovery, they teach conformity. The first scribe, whose practice would have invented or standardized the system, leaves no trace beyond these tablets. Even exercises that seem pedagogical practice repetitions of numerical or commodity records, assume prior knowledge. Clay tablets show sequences where the scribe is expected to copy quantities, items, and measures with minimal guidance. Errors are corrected, but the methodology for learning is implicit rather than documented. Instruction seems to rely on hands-on repetition within a framework already established. The administrative bureaucracy itself reinforces this continuity. Temple and palace archives contain tablets for recording offerings, labor, and rations. Each tablet follows conventions that could only function if scribes were trained uniformly. Orders, lists, and receipts are legible and coherent, indicating oversight and a shared understanding. The system presupposes not experimentation but fidelity. The problem extends beyond writing technique. Scribes had to navigate legal, commercial, and ritual contexts simultaneously. The texts assume comprehension of property rights, measures, calendrical systems, and cultic obligations. The earliest training must have encompassed these domains, yet no early curricula survive. The scribe appears already as a mediator between human action and record, a professional whose authority and competence are implicit. Later texts confirm that scribal knowledge was hereditary or institutional. Families, temples, and palaces maintained lines of scribes, often nomming students and teachers. The tradition emphasizes preservation. Errors were dangerous precisely because deviation could disrupt administration. But these later records imply continuity backward in time to a point before any surviving documentation. There is an origin that is acknowledged only by its absence. Physical evidence, such as stylus marks and tablet dimensions, suggests standardized methods that must have been taught. Lines, margins, and sign orientation reflect conventions that cannot be intuitive alone. The scribe's work is guided by habit and instruction. Yet without surviving precursors, the question arises: how did these conventions arise initially, and how were they maintained long enough to become second nature? In the broader context of early civilization, this issue is mirrored elsewhere. Measures, calendars, medical procedures, and urban layouts all appear fully formed. Scribal practice is a nexus where these elements converge. The scribe does not invent the system, the scribe transmits it. The absence of formative stages highlights the gap between the emergence of literacy and the persistence of memory. If the first scribes were already fully operational, then the systems they recorded, administrative, astronomical, legal, and ritual, must also predate their training. Knowledge and procedure were inherited, encoded in clay, and continuously restored. Yet the origin of that inheritance remains obscured. And if the practice of writing appears complete before the earliest schools are preserved, then who shaped the first standards, and by what method were they transmitted so reliably that the initial stages of learning vanish entirely from the archaeological record? If scribes could appear fully trained and tablets could transmit knowledge across generations, then the instruments used to enact that knowledge, the tools themselves, must also reflect continuity and precision. Excavations at sites such as Uruk, Eridu, and Tel Abu Salabik reveal assemblages of tools that seem to appear in completed forms, with few indications of gradual evolution. Axes, chisels, adzes, and digging implements are crafted with consistent dimensions and materials, suggesting standards of manufacture already established. These tools are found in contexts that align with administrative, architectural, and ritual activity. Clay impressions of wooden handles indicate careful shaping to ensure functionality. Copper implements are hammered and polished to uniform specifications. Even the simplest stone tools show deliberate selection of material and symmetry of form. Each object operates within an understood system: a tool for a task, an implement for a record, a device for construction. The record is of use, not invention. Typological studies reveal that transitional forms, the intermediate stages one might expect between rudimentary stone implements and the more complex, standardized varieties, are notably scarce. In several regions, the earliest recovered axes already possess hafting grooves, balanced weights, and precise cutting edges. Early chisels exhibit uniform angles and polished surfaces. The assemblages suggest that a developmental sequence, if it existed, left few traces in the archaeological record. The absence of intermediate stages is striking when compared to other regions, where evolutionary sequences of tool forms are evident. In Sumerian contexts, the material culture implies knowledge transfer rather than gradual experimentation. Tools are not improvised; they are repeated according to precedent. The scribe, builder, or artisan seems to inherit a set of expectations about what the object must achieve and how it should be made. The construction of monumental structures, particularly the early platforms and foundations beneath ziggurats, relies on these implements. Mud brick, stone, and timber are worked to precise dimensions. The correspondence between tools and architectural requirements indicates that the instruments were designed with a clear understanding of intended outcomes. Functionality is embedded in the object, just as procedure is embedded in the tablet. Labor organization further illuminates the role of these tools. Records describe allocations of workmen, quantities of material moved, and the distribution of tools across teams. The tablets show oversight, measurement, and accountability. Each implement has its place, each hand its responsibility, and each measure its standard. The tools are thus not merely objects; they are instruments of administration, codifying effort as much as they accomplish it physically. Experimental archaeology has attempted to recreate these implements. Replications confirm that they are highly efficient, but also that their production requires knowledge of metallurgy, wood selection, and shaping techniques. Mastery is not intuitive; it is taught and preserved. Yet the earliest physical examples do not reflect the incremental learning one might anticipate. The initial forms appear operationally complete, suggesting an inherited repertoire rather than trial-and-error innovation. Some artifacts bear inscriptions or markings that further suggest standardization. Numerical notations on weights, incised symbols on handles, and markings indicating ownership or function indicate that the tool was both practical and administratively accountable. The physical object is therefore entwined with the record, a tangible extension of the scribe's work. Use and documentation are inseparable. The Anunnaki, when mentioned in connection with labor or craft in lexical and administrative texts, are associated with oversight and allocation rather than direct creation. The tools, like the measures and procedures previously discussed, operate within a framework that presupposes order. Skill is exercised within inherited limits, and the instrument is effective because it conforms to expectation. Yet the problem remains. The absence of transitional forms raises questions about the origin of standardization. How were the first specifications determined? How was the knowledge of proper shape, material, and function transmitted without leaving earlier experimental stages in the record? If the initial objects were already refined, then the earliest moments of craftsmanship, when trial became convention, remain invisible. And if these implements appear suddenly in fully operational form, then what processes preserved both their design and their use across generations before the presence of formal instruction or recorded apprenticeship, ensuring that each tool maintained fidelity to its original standard? If tools could be fully formed and scribes trained before preserved instruction, then the patterns of inherited knowledge may extend beyond Sumer itself. When the earliest Sumerian texts recount foundations, kingship, and codified practice, they occupy a historical landscape that appears remarkably self-contained, yet echoes of similar organization emerge elsewhere. In Egypt, early dynastic inscriptions show administrative precision and codified ritual practice. In the Indus Valley, urban layouts and standardized weights suggest complex systems appearing without visible developmental stages. These parallels do not imply direct contact, but they indicate a shared mode in which knowledge, once established, was treated as given and transmitted across generations. In Egypt, the Palermo stone and the Narmer palette record kingship, offerings, and seasonal observations. The inscriptions convey authority descending from an established order, much as the Sumerian king list frames kingship as descending from heaven. Administrative lists, temple inventories, and measures of grain appear alongside ceremonial record-keeping, demonstrating that the preservation of order predates the emergence of formal bureaucratic institutions. Like Sumer, the earliest Egyptian records do not chronicle the learning process. They reflect a system already codified. In the Indus Valley, urban centers such as Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa present standardized brick sizes, systematic street grids, and uniform weights and measures. These material consistencies suggest inherited knowledge, maintained across multiple settlements. No early transitional artifacts reveal the evolution of these systems, mirroring the Sumerian problem of sudden standardization. While the script of the Indus remains undeciphered, the administrative and architectural evidence indicates that procedures were practiced with fidelity to established norms rather than invented incrementally. Across these regions, a common theme emerges. Practices and forms appear operationally complete at their earliest visible stages. Writing, architecture, urban planning, and measurement function as instruments of continuity. The presence of these systems implies a prior phase of consolidation, a preparation of knowledge that remains archaeologically invisible. Where the Sumerians inscribed transactions and allocations, the Egyptians recorded offerings and rains, and the Indus inhabitants codified dimensions and weights. In each case, the material or textual record preserves inherited practice rather than experimental development. Lexical parallels are also notable. In Sumer, lexical lists record signs, objects, and numerical correspondences, serving both as mnemonic and pedagogical tools. In Egypt, early hieroglyphic lists of offerings, personnel, and titles perform a comparable function. While the signs themselves differ, the method of transmitting structured knowledge appears analogous. The learner absorbs pre-established conventions through copying, recitation, and supervised practice. These approaches emphasize continuity over invention, memory over innovation. Material culture reinforces these connections. Standardized pottery, measures, and administrative implements are found in each region, often embedded within the same contexts as civic or ritual structures. The organization of space, labor, and record-keeping indicates that early civilizations treated inherited systems as integral to social and religious order. Disruption was possible, as with Sumerian flood layers, yet the framework persisted, ensuring that subsequent generations could reproduce familiar forms with fidelity. Sumerian emphasis on divine endorsement, invoking the Anunnaki as guarantors of order, has echoes elsewhere. Egyptian texts attribute authority to gods or semi-divine figures, and Indus urban design implies ritualized spatial planning. These parallels do not suggest transmission of theology or mythology, but they underscore a shared conception. Inherited systems, whether administrative, architectural, or ritual, derive legitimacy from continuity and precedent rather than invention. Comparison also highlights the selective nature of memory. In each region, certain practices are preserved while others vanish. Not all disruptions are recorded, not all innovations survive. What endures is treated as canonical, codified, and repeatable. This pattern implies an intentionality in preservation. Knowledge is stabilized not only by recording, but by institutional and material reinforcement. The scribes, builders, and officials act as custodians, safeguarding what is deemed essential for continuity. Yet these global echoes provoke further reflection. The reappearance of standardized forms, administrative practices, and codified ritual across distinct early civilizations raises questions about the mechanisms of memory itself. How was knowledge reliably transmitted over generations in environments separated by geography and culture? What conditions allowed complex systems to emerge fully operational without leaving observable developmental stages? And if such practices appear independently yet similarly across the ancient world, then what underlying structures of human memory, social organization, and inherited administration made it possible for civilization itself to arrive already methodical, codified, and enduring, as if the earliest builders and scribes had been entrusted with frameworks older than their own experience? The material, textual, and administrative systems that appear fully formed in early Sumerian civilization are remarkable not only for their precision, but also for the way their deterioration is recorded, or more often not recorded. Excavations of later Uruk and Lagash strata reveal layers of abandonment, flood debris, and rebuilding. In these contexts, tablets are broken, archives are scattered, and architectural standards lapse. Yet even in collapse, the records emphasize continuity rather than invention. The texts often frame disorder as the interruption of a known order, implying that the systems themselves predate the loss. Collapse is treated as a disturbance, not as the first emergence of practice. The Sumerian king list, which catalogs dynasties and the length of reigns, presents kingship as a phenomenon descending from heaven, yet the intervals of disruption between rulers are acknowledged in the language of lapses and absences. Dynasties end, cities are deserted, and floods or invasions mark temporal discontinuities. Administrative tablets recovered from these strata often bear signs of hurried preservation. Clay envelopes enclosing partial texts, tablets placed in temples or buried in corners of buildings. These measures suggest that scribes and officials recognized collapse as a hazard to memory, not as the natural origin of their practices. Archaeological layers indicate that certain technologies, measures, and building techniques vanish temporarily, only to reappear in subsequent rebuilding. Standardized weights, architectural norms, and even lexical lists may be missing from intermediate layers, then re-emerge with remarkable fidelity. This pattern implies an awareness that the practices were not being invented anew, but restored from memory. The gap between loss and recovery is treated as the interruption of a pre-existing continuum, rather than a series of novel innovations. Ritual and cultic texts reinforce the same perspective. Temple offerings, liturgical formulas, and hymns sometimes survive only partially, yet the structure of practice remains intelligible to later scribes. Instructions for priestly conduct, sacrificial quantities, and calendrical rites are reconstructed from fragments, suggesting that the collapse of physical structures did not erase procedural knowledge entirely. The act of recovery itself is framed as preservation, implying that what is lost is part of a larger inherited system. Even literary and administrative compositions from periods following disruption emphasize restoration over creation. Lexical lists and commodity records are copied with fidelity from older exemplars, sometimes centuries removed from the originals. Measures, numerals, and sign forms are retained despite interruptions in settlement, demonstrating a conscious effort to maintain continuity. Scribes act as custodians, aware that collapse is a temporal disturbance, not a starting point. Comparisons between early and later strata also indicate selective preservation. Certain tools, measures, and procedures vanish entirely in some layers, while others persist. Flood deposits, fire, or deliberate destruction obscure archives, yet the subsequent reconstruction relies on recovered models. In this sense, collapse functions as an inflection in memory rather than as the beginning of civilization. The emphasis in the record is on restoring the pre-existing order, not inventing it from scratch. Even monumental architecture reflects this mindset. Ziggurats, platforms, and city layouts show evidence of multiple cycles of building and rebuilding. Foundations are reused, orientations preserved, and design templates applied repeatedly. When structures are damaged, the reconstruction follows inherited standards rather than experimental departures. The texts accompanying these projects note labor assignments, materials, and measures with a precision that implies continuity through prior knowledge, suggesting that collapse does not mark the origin of practice, but its temporary suspension. Cultural memory, as embedded in both texts and material culture, treats disruption as the rupture of a previously established framework. Administrative and ritual systems are maintained through both physical replication and textual instruction. Even when floods, invasions, or societal breakdowns occur, the surviving records indicate that the core practices were never entirely new. They were restored, preserved, and repeated in accordance with inherited models. Yet this raises an enduring question about the nature of beginnings and endings in Sumerian thought. If collapse is consistently framed as a loss rather than a point of origin, then what does it imply about the periods before the first recorded systems? Were the earliest practices themselves already inherited from prior generations or frameworks, now largely invisible? And how much of what we treat as invention in the earliest strata is in fact the restoration of knowledge older than the texts themselves? Even as the Sumerian tablets preserve remarkable detail about kingship, administration, measures, and rituals, they also leave gaps that resist explanation. Excavated archives, often carefully stored in temple corners or buried in mud brick foundations, show fragments of lists, incomplete inventories, and partially erased signs. Certain tablets catalog commodities, labor, or offerings with meticulous regularity, yet other entries are missing entirely or abruptly interrupted. The lacunae are not merely accidental. They are consistent enough to suggest that some aspects of knowledge were treated as assumed, or perhaps deliberately omitted, from the written record. Lexical lists, which provide insight into language, materials, and objects, often include terms whose precise meaning is now uncertain. Signs are repeated across different tablets with apparent consistency, yet the contexts in which they are employed sometimes contradict each other. In some cases, the same sign denotes multiple objects or concepts, depending on location or administrative purpose. The texts themselves acknowledge this variability, though they offer no explanation. It appears that scribes operated within an established framework, of understanding that the records only partially externalize. Administrative documents, too, exhibit silences. Temple accounts record allocations of grain, labor, and tools, yet the rationale for certain distributions is absent. Why specific quantities were assigned to certain temples or workshops is not explained, nor are the criteria for prioritization of tasks fully elaborated. The assumption seems to have been that such knowledge was shared, understood by practitioners, and therefore need not be written. What is preserved is procedural and tangible. What is absent is the reasoning that underlies it. Even historical narratives, such as the Sumerian king list, contain contradictions that remain unresolved. Reigns are sometimes impossibly long, and dynastic sequences vary between copies. Some kings are named in one version and absent in another. These inconsistencies imply a tension between memory and record, between the desire to preserve continuity and the reality of transmission over centuries. The scribes appear aware of these difficulties, yet the texts rarely acknowledge the uncertainty explicitly. Archaeological evidence similarly leaves questions unanswered. Excavations of Uruk, Eridu, and Kish reveal strata where settlement seems continuous, yet the material culture changes abruptly. Tools, ceramics, and architectural forms appear fully developed after apparent gaps in the record. Certain practices vanish from the archaeological strata, only to reappear intact in subsequent layers. The reason for these absences, environmental, social, or administrative, is rarely clarified, leaving scholars to confront discontinuities without definitive interpretation. Ritual and liturgical texts provide additional ambiguities. Instructions for offerings, festivals, and temple service are sometimes incomplete, with portions of procedures left unspecified. The sequences of ritual action are implied rather than fully spelled out, suggesting that the scribes assumed a trained audience capable of filling in the details. Yet for modern researchers, these gaps highlight the limits of the record. The preserved texts describe what is necessary to maintain order, but not what is universally understood or performed without inscription. Medical, astronomical, and metrological texts similarly present partial knowledge. Formulas for treatments, measures, or calendar calculations are recorded, yet the rationale behind certain selections remains obscure. In some instances, tablets juxtapose unrelated subjects, leaving uncertain whether the juxtaposition reflects association, chronology, or convenience. These silences suggest that the surviving records capture a fraction of operational knowledge, leaving its full structure hidden from view. Even within administrative standardization, contradictions emerge. Measures of grain or length vary slightly between regions, yet the texts treat them as uniform. Procedures described for one city are sometimes incompatible with those from another, hinting at local adaptation within an overarching framework. The records themselves do not reconcile these differences, leaving them as points of tension. These unresolved contradictions highlight both the precision and the limitations of Sumerian documentation. Detailed yet partial, codified yet incomplete. Ultimately, the gaps and silences of the tablets emphasize the nature of memory in early civilization. The records preserve what was essential for continuity, kingship, offerings, measures, and administration, but they cannot, and perhaps never intended to, preserve everything. Certain knowledge was assumed, transmitted orally, or embedded in practice rather than inscription. The texts provide a window into a sophisticated system, yet that window is always framed by absence. And so, if the tablets record so much yet leave so much unexplained, then what aspects of Sumerian life, administration, and inherited practice existed beyond the written record, preserved only in human memory, gesture, or uninscribed labor, waiting silently for understanding that the surviving texts cannot fully convey? Thank you for taking this journey with me tonight. I hope you've come away with a deeper appreciation for what the Sumerian texts actually reveal, for the difference between authentic ancient wisdom and modern fantasy, and for the remarkable achievements of our ancestors who built civilization without outside help. If this exploration fascinated you, if you appreciated diving into the authentic texts and archaeology, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into ancient mysteries. And I'd love to hear from you. What aspect of Sumerian mythology or archaeology interests you most? What other ancient texts or civilizations should we explore? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, may your path through history's deepest mysteries be illuminated by curiosity, guided by critical thinking, and enriched by authentic wonder. The ancient world has so much to teach us, if we're willing to listen to what it actually says rather than what we wish it said. The Sumerians have been speaking to us across 4,000 years through their clay tablets. The least we can do is hear them accurately.